are arguably the most important. From login and registration screens to checkout pages, forms are arguably the most important and valuable tool for communicating with the end users of our applications and collecting valuable information from them. Vue makes it fun and easy to build a wide array of forms, ranging from single input forms like a search bar to very complex schema-driven forms, thanks to its component-driven architecture and reactivity system. Vue is, of course, a component-based framework where we can create a bit of code and reuse it throughout our application in a packaged container called a component. These components communicate with each other via props and events, and through these connections we create a dynamic application. Forms in particular benefit greatly from encapsulating the logic of input elements into components. As our applications grow, our forms usually grow too, and having forms that are built without components usually becomes a ticking time bomb. At some point, you might need to change the look and feel of your elements, or perhaps make them behave differently in relation to their label, or even introduce a new type of validation. All of these scenarios become exponentially more complex when the inputs in your form are not encapsulated into components. In this course, we will build a set of components that will handle the most common cases for form inputs in your applications. They will be highly reusable, but also adaptable to scale for any of your application needs. While building these components, we will reinforce the fundamental concepts of how components communicate with each other and your form through props, events, listeners, attributes, and so on. We will go through the best practices on how to capture and submit our forms, and finally, we will touch up on the basics of accessibility. With these concepts and new tools under your developer tool belt, you will be able to understand and build any range of forms for your own applications. In order to get the most out of this course, you should have experience with the following topic: a basic understanding of what vModel is and how it interacts with native input elements. If you aren't familiar with it, I recommend that you check our Intro to Vue 3 course. We will incorporate these concepts while focusing on how Vue 3 simplifies and empowers form component composition. Ready to jump in? See you in the first lesson. Throughout this course, we will be building a set of reusable form components and exploring best practices along the way. In order to build this, we'll want a demo form to use as a starting point, which we will break apart into these base components. I've prepared one so that we can jump right in. We have a form that includes a couple of different input elements: a select element for the category, a few input elements of type text, a radio input, and 2 checkboxes. Everything in this form is vModeled. Let's look at the code behind this. Here's a code for the form that we just saw. As you can see, it contains the HTML code for all the input elements that we just saw in the browser. Let's now scroll down to our script section. Inside the export default, we have our data function. Inside the return object, we have a categories array that is being used to power the select element. We also have an event object. Each of its properties are being bound into one of our elements in the form. The goal of this lesson is to create a base input component. Whenever we are building forms in Vue, creating reusable form components for each specific input type will allow us to replicate them, modify them, and extend them. This also ensures that throughout our form and even throughout our whole application, our inputs will be consistent. Let's dive right in and create our first component. We're going to get started by going into the components folder and creating the base input.vue file. We will also add the template that will hold our code. Now I will go to the simple form.view component and copy in the code for the first element. I'm going to copy the label and the input and bring it over to our base input.view component. We are going to transform this static code into something more reusable and flexible. After all, that's the benefit of making components. In Vue 3, we can have multiple root nodes. This means we can have the label and the input at root level without needing to wrap them in a single root element like a div, like we had to in Vue 2. Let's check out the things that we need to do in order to make this component completely reusable and flexible. First, we're going to add a label property. Then we need to figure out how to allow vModeling into our component. Finally, we're going to look at how to bind the $attrs object into our component correctly. The first thing we need to do is to allow our component to receive a label from the parent. To do this, we're going to create a label property. Let's go ahead and add the script and export default and the props object. We'll create a label property with the type of string and a default of an empty string. Now we can use our new label property through interpolation inside our template's label element. While we're at it, we're going to delete the vModel directive since we're no longer going to be using it inside the component. We'll come back to using vModel later on. We will also delete type because it will be provided as part of the attributes by the parent. Remember that we want to keep the component as flexible as possible. The user of this component may want to make it of type email or password, and the default for input is already of type text if not declared. Finally, let's bind the placeholder attribute to our label property as well. This will make sure that both the hint text inside the input and the actual label are coordinated and reactive. Now that our component has its basic structure and the label, we can move to adding the capability for our component to be vModel ready. By default in Vue 3, vModel expects a property named ModelValue to be on your vModel capable component. Let's go ahead and add this new property, and then bind it to the value attribute of our input. We will add the ModelValue property here, with the type of string or number, and default it to an empty string. There is a good chance that the parent may try to bind either a text or string like hello to our input, but it may also try to bind a numeric value, like the user's age or 30. We need to be able to allow either to be set. Let's go ahead and add the value binding and bind it to our new property ModelValue. Now that we have our ModelValue property set and bound to the input attribute of the input element, let's look at the second part of the vModel two-way binding, emitting an event. All components that are capable of being vModeled have to emit an event in order for the parent to be able to catch the updates to that component's data. In Vue 3, by default, all vModel contracts expect for your component to emit an update ModelValue event, regardless of what type of input or inputs your component contains. Let's go ahead and add an input event listener to our input element and emit an update ModelValue event whenever an input element occurs. Let's go ahead and add the input event listener. We're going to $emit the update ModelValue event, and as the payload, we will pass event target.value. Adding this input listener to our input element allows us to fire off the required event every time the user types something into the input field. Notice that we're passing the event's target value event.target.value as the payload of the event. This is the value that the vModel will receive on the parent. Speaking of the parent, let's go back to our form and use the new base input component instead of our native elements to test out our code. We will replace title, description, and location inputs in our form with our new component. Let's navigate back to simple form. We will add our first base input here, and it will replace the title. So we will bind bModel again to event.title. Next, we will set the label property equal to title. Finally, we will add a type of text. We can now delete the original code. Remember that label is not an attribute, it is the property that we created in the beginning of this lesson. Next, let's add another base input for our description. We will add a bModel binding to event.description. Next, we will set our label equal to description. And finally, the type equal to text. We can now delete the original code. Let's go ahead and do this one more time for our location. We will create another base input instance. Then we will bModel it to event.location. We will set our label property equal to location and our type equal to text. We can then again delete the original code. Let's go ahead and look at this in the browser. At the moment of this recording, the Vue 3 developer tools are still in beta. I've gone ahead and added the output of our bModel bindings here into the form so that we can see it in action. I'm going to go ahead and write something into our inputs. Our component seems to be working, but there seems to be a problem with the styles. If we inspect the component further, it seems that our type attribute is nowhere to be found. We want to be able to assign attributes like type into the component's input when we set them on the instance in the parent. Let's take a look at how to achieve this. Before we go into the code, let's check out our to-do list. We've added the label property. We've made sure that bModeling works into our component. Now we will look into how to bind the attrs object correctly. In Vue, whenever you pass down attributes, classes, and styles from the parent to a child, like we are doing with the type in our base input component, Vue will attempt to automatically figure out where inside your template these attributes should be injected. In components with a single wrapping element, also known as single root components, this behavior is very straightforward. Vue will simply inject all the attributes, classes, and styles into the root element. In multi-root components, such as our base input, Vue cannot figure out without our help which one of the nodes or fragments it should inject the attribute to. So Vue simply gives up and issues a warning. In the case of our base input component, we want to be able to inject attributes directly into the input, so we have to manually bind the attrs object to it. Let's go ahead and do that now by binding the attrs into our input element. Let's go ahead and add a bbind declaration here. Inside of this declaration, we will add $attrs. With this small change, the input elements will now correctly receive the type binding from the parent, and our CSS classes will be applied. Let's check this out in the browser. Everything is looking a lot better now. Let's see if it still works. Everything seems to be working correctly. In this lesson, we learned how to create our first component, the base input. We also learned how to create a component that is bModel ready. Did you notice that we never actually imported base input in our form component before we used it? I don't want you to worry about that right now. In lesson 4, we will go into detail about the magic that happens behind the scenes in order to accomplish this. In our next lesson, we will build our next form component, the base select. See you there. Welcome back. In our previous lesson, we learned how to create our first reusable form component, the base input. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to create our second component, the base select. Let's dive right in. Currently in our sample form, we have the following select element. Our objective for this lesson is to turn this code into our reusable component, just like we did for base input in the previous lesson. As we did with the base input element, we're going to create a new component file called baseselect.view. I'm also going to add the base template that will hold our HTML code. Let's go back now and copy the select element, along with its corresponding label, into the new file. Let's check out our to-do list for the base select component. First, we're going to add a label property. Then we are going to make the component vModel capable. Finally, we will look into making the options reactive. In order for a component to be flexible, we need to allow the parent to be able to modify and provide content details, such as the label. Just like we did it in base input, our first step is going to add a property named label. So let's go ahead and add that property here, and then we're going to type it to string and the default of an empty string. We can now go ahead and, using interpolation binding to the label element, I'm going to add a BF condition to check that the label is set before displaying it. Just like we did in base input, we want to make sure that our base select component is vModel ready. That way, whenever it is used by our parent form or any other form, it can easily be used with a double binding directly into our parent's state. Select elements do have a couple of differences and gotchas, so let's take a look at those. Going back to our to-do list, we are done with adding the label property. Now we're going to take a look at making the component vModel capable. The first thing we need to do is remove the old vModel declaration from the code that we just pasted from the original form. Next, we're going to add the model value property to the component. Let's go ahead and add it here, again with a type of string or number and a default of an empty string. Now let's bind the value attribute of the select element to it. We will add the value and bind it to model value. Remember that model value is the default name of the property that Vue will look for when double binding through vModel to custom components. While we're at it, we'll also add a class of field to the select element so that it looks nicer. Now that the value binding of the select is set, we have to add the second part of the vModel contract, the emit. This part of the binding will allow our component to communicate to its parent that the data has changed and needs to be updated on the parent's state. Select elements fire a change event whenever the user makes a new selection. So unlike our base input component, we are going to listen to the select element's change event. Since we are also going to need to bind the $attrs object to our select element, like we did on the input element for base input, we'll tackle them together and bind them using the vbind syntax. Let's go ahead and add a vbind into the attrs object. Since $attrs is an object, we can use the JavaScript spread operator to combine our binds into a single object. Let's go ahead and wrap everything into an object. We will use the spread operator to spread out the $attrs object into a containing object. This will allow us to now add into this object our onChange event listener, which will be a function that receives an event as the function's parameter, and then emits the update model value event with a payload of event target value. Notice that this time we are not using a direct binding by setting up our change event listener with the @change keyword, like we did on our base input component for the @input event. This time we are setting up our event binding directly into the vbind object. after our $attrs binding. In View 3, it's important to remember that if we choose not to use the @ syntax, the event will be prefixed by the keyword on. In this case, onChange, since we are listening to the change event. All event listeners that are received in $attrs from the parent are prefixed with the on keyword and the first letter is capitalized. So @change becomes onChange. @input becomes onInput. On our change listener for onChange, we capture the event as the function's parameter and emit our event update model value with the payload of event target value to notify the parent of any changes. Let's check out our to-do list one more time. Now that we have made the component vModel capable, it is time to make the options reactive. I want to draw your attention to the before loop that we currently have on the option element in our select. Notice that we are looping over the categories array that does not exist in our component. This is still very tightly coupled to what the parent is trying to do with this particular input. In order to make our base select component work with any array of options, we're going to first rename categories to options in our before loop. Let's go ahead and rename this here to options. Then we will create an options prop so that our component can receive this information from the parent. It will be a type of array, and this time it will be required. The reason to make this property required is that without it, the base select will simply not work. Let's scroll back up. The second thing that we need to fix is the selected binding for the option element loop. Currently, we're trying to check if the current option that we're looping over is equal to event.category, which is also tightly coupled to the parent. In this case, we can safely change this to check to see if option is equal to model value. So let's go ahead and make that change. This will satisfy the HTML requirement so that the option updates whenever the model value changes. With these changes, we can now go back to our form and switch out the select element for our brand new base select and check it out in the browser. Let's go back to simpleform.view. We have a select element at the very top of the form. Let's go ahead and add here our new base select instance. We will first bind the options property to the categories array. We will add a vModel binding to event.category, and our label property will be set to select a category. We can now delete the original code. If we check out our form in the browser, we can see that our dropdown still works as expected, now powered behind the scenes by our reusable form component. In this lesson, we learned how to create a reusable base select component. Have you noticed that we have not been importing either base select or base input into our simpleform.view component and it still works? In the next lesson, I'm going to show you the bit of magic that I'm using behind the scenes in order to automatically import all the components that start with the base prefix. After all, that's why we've been naming them as such. See you there. Welcome back. In our last two lessons, I mentioned that both our components, base input and base select, have been magically getting imported without having to use an import statement or a global import. In this lesson, we will take a look at why. Often in Vue projects, we create collections of components, such as these two, that are the building blocks for other components that are usually more complex. In our case, we're creating a collection of components that is going to be used to create forms. Manually importing each one by using app.component can very quickly get really tedious. Luckily for us, there's a way to do this automatically. Let's navigate now to the main.js file of our project and take a look at what's happening in there together. First, we import create app from Vue in order to create and later mount our application. We also import the app.vue component to set it as the entry point of our application. Please note that this is not specific for auto-importing components, but part of the process for creating and mounting our Vue 3 application. Finally, we import upper first and camel case from Lodash, a JavaScript library that provides utility functions for common programming tasks. Uppercase converts the first character of a string to uppercase. In this example, base-input turns into base-input, but with a capital B. Camel case converts a string to camel case. In this example, we can see that base-input with a capital B gets turned into base-input with a capital B and a capital I, and the dash is removed. To actually be able to use Lodash in our project, we first need to add it to our application. Please open up a terminal and run the following command on your project root. This will add Lodash to your package.json file and install the dependency files in your Node modules folder. Next up, we use Webpack's function require.context to allow Webpack to know that it needs to require all of the files in the components folder that starts with the base prefix. Notice that we are also allowing it to require both .vue and .js extensions. Next, we create our Vue application by calling create app with our app.vue component reference and store it in an app constant so that we can reference our app context later. Further down into the code, we're going to call the keys function on our require component to get an array of file names, which will contain the root to each of our base components. In our case, the keys function will return this array containing the base input and base select paths. We are going to loop through each of our components in this array. Ready? First, we get the component object by using the file name to extract it from the array. Next, we will use Lodash's upper first and camel case functions along with a regular expression to parse our file names. The regular expression here will strip anything before the component name and the extension, leaving us with just the name of the component, base input. As you can see in the example above, even this ./base-input.vue will get parsed into base input. The regular expression here will strip anything before the component name and the extension. Next, we will use the camel case function to strip out any dashes and turn it into a camel case. We will use upper first to turn the first character into an uppercase character. Finally, we use the component name that we just extracted and the component configuration that we got earlier to register the component as a global component. We wrap up the file by mounting our application into the element with an ID of app. This bit of code may seem daunting at first, but once you add it to your application, you can forget about it and let it do its work of auto-importing your base components for you. It is just important that you understand what it's doing and what are the benefits of bringing in automatic component registration. In our next lesson, we will keep on building our form components, this time the base checkbox. See you there! we're building a collection of components. In our case, welcome back. Previously in this course, we created reusable components for two very important HTML inputs, the base select and the base input, for select elements and input elements respectively. In this lesson, we will take on the challenge of creating a reusable component for checkbox inputs. Our goals remain the same. Our component should be highly reusable, with a label property that can be bound, and they should be able to accept a two-way model binding through vModeling. Let's dive right in. First, we'll create a new file, baseCheckbox.view, inside the Components folder. We are going to add a template block and copy the input with type checkbox in our simpleform.view file, which holds the control for the catering into it. As we've done in our other components, we're going to tackle the label first. We need to make sure that we have a way to inject a label into this component. So we're going to add a label prop so that the parent can pass it down to our component. It will be of type of string and a default of an empty string. Now that we have our label property set, let's go to the label element and bind it using interpolation, and also make sure that we have a BF checking if the label exists. There's no real reason to render an empty label tag, and worse, we don't want to label it as an empty string. There are several accessibility considerations when talking about labels and inputs, and what we've been doing so far is not really accessible. However, in a later lesson, we will come back to all of these components and revisit accessibility in a separate lesson. Let's revisit our to-dos. The label property is added and bound. Next, let's talk about vModel binding. Checkbox have a few quirks that we need to keep in mind before we start setting up our bindings. The first one is that checkbox inputs bind their state to a checked property and not directly to value. The property value of checkboxes is not usually used on the front end, since its main purpose is to provide a value when submitted to the backend via a submit button. If omitted, this value defaults to on, which is fine for most apps, since most forms will be handled via some asynchronous posting and the passed variables to the backend are controlled by the front-end code. The second thing we need to keep in mind is that inputs with type checkbox don't trigger input events, but change events whenever they are selected and unselected. Now that we are armed with this knowledge, let's add the first part of our vModel contract, the model value prop. It will allow the parent to inject its state into the checkbox component. Let's go into the props object and add the model value prop. It will be of type Boolean and the default will be of false. Now, let's go into the template and replace the vModel binding that was copy-pasted from the demo form earlier with our new checked binding into our model value property. Finally, we need to emit update model value whenever we want to alert the parent that the checkbox has been toggled. We will listen to the change event on the input element and emit the new checked state of our element whenever it fires. Notice that for checkboxes, we are not emitting the target's value through event target value, but instead the checked status through event target checked. Now that our component is ready, we can go back to simple form and replace both the catering and live music checkboxes with our brand new base checkbox component. We will start with the catering checkbox. Let's add a base checkbox instance with a V model of Event Extras Catering. Next, we will add the label property equal to catering. Let's do this one more time for the live music. We will add a base checkbox instance, add a V model binding to Event Extras Music, and finally add the label property equal to live music. Let's head over to our browser and toggle the checkboxes on and off to make sure the bindings are working. It looks like both the catering and live music checkboxes are working. As you can see below, the vModel binding correctly switches from true to false whenever I click them. Checkboxes have a few quirks that we had to learn in order to create our base checkbox component. In our next lesson, we're going to create our last component, the base radio for radio buttons. We will take a look at what makes them special and sometimes hard to deal with. See you there. Welcome back.